Berlin, Germany, April 30th, 1945. The city was dying. Captain Sarah Mitchell had seen a lot in her 2 years with the U.S. Army, but nothing had prepared her for Berlin. The once proud capital of the Third Reich was now a landscape of apocalypse. Buildings reduced to skeletal frameworks, streets choked with rubble, the air thick with smoke and the stench of death. Sarah was a rare presence in the forward combat zones, a female officer in the Women's Army Corps, attached to civil affairs as a liaison and interpreter. At 32, she was older than most of the soldiers around her, a former schoolteacher from Pennsylvania who spoke fluent German thanks to her immigrant grandparents. The Army needed people who could communicate with German civilians, help establish order in the conquered territories, distinguish between hardcore Nazis and ordinary Germans just trying to survive. Today, she was with a patrol from the 2nd Armored Division, moving through the Charlottenburg district of Berlin. Soviet forces were closing in from the east, American and British forces from the west. The battle for Berlin was in its final brutal days. Hitler was rumored to be holed up in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. The war was hours, maybe days, from its end, but those final hours were proving to be the bloodiest. The patrol consisted of 8 men: Lieutenant James Walsh from Boston, their commander; Sergeant Marcus Johnson, a black soldier from Alabama who'd seen action from Normandy to the Rhine; Corporal Tommy Reeves from Texas; Private First Class David Chen from San Francisco; and 4 other soldiers, all exhausted, all jumpy, all ready for this war to be over. They were clearing buildings, looking for SS holdouts and weapons caches. The Nazis were fighting with desperate ferocity, knowing there would be no mercy, no negotiation. SS troops and Hitler Youth were making last stands in burnt-out buildings, taking American lives even as their own cause crumbled to ash. The firefight started without warning. The patrol had entered what looked like an abandoned apartment building, 5 stories of pre-war elegance now gutted by artillery fire. They were on the 3rd floor when machine gun fire erupted from the stairwell above. The distinctive sound of an MG-42, Hitler's buzzsaw. "Contact! 4th floor!" Walsh shouted, diving for cover. The patrol scattered, taking positions behind walls and debris. The machine gun raked the hallway, chewing through plaster and brick. Sarah pressed herself against a wall, her heart hammering. She carried a pistol, all officers did, but she'd never fired it in combat. Her job was translation and administration, not fighting. "Johnson Chen, flank right," Walsh ordered. "Reeves, Thompson with me. We're going up the center stairwell." What followed was 15 minutes of close-quarters hell. The SS troops, 3 men in the remains of black uniforms, fought like cornered animals. Grenades exploded in enclosed spaces. Machine gun fire echoed through the shattered building. The Americans advanced floor by floor, room by room. Sarah stayed back with the radio operator, Private Miller, coordinating with headquarters, calling for backup that probably wouldn't arrive in time. She could hear the battle raging above, shouts in German and English, the thunder of grenades, screams. Then, suddenly, silence. "Clear," Walsh's voice echoed down the stairwell. "Building secure. We've got 3 enemy KIA. No friendly casualties." Sarah exhaled, her whole body shaking from adrenaline. She and Miller climbed the stairs to the 4th floor. The hallway was a war zone. Walls pockmarked with bullets, spent shell casings everywhere, smoke hanging in the air. 3 SS soldiers lay dead, their weapons scattered around them. The American soldiers were checking the bodies, gathering intelligence, documents, maps, anything useful. Sergeant Johnson was tending to a minor shrapnel wound on Corporal Reeves's arm. "Captain Mitchell," Walsh said, "we found what looks like an officer's quarters at the end of the hall. Might have intelligence value. Could you take a look?" Sarah nodded and made her way down the corridor. The door at the end had been blown off its hinges by a grenade. Inside was a large apartment that had once been elegant. High ceilings, ornate molding, tall windows looking out over the ruined city. Now it was wrecked, furniture overturned, glass everywhere, one wall partially collapsed from artillery damage. But it had clearly been someone's home. A home occupied by a Nazi officer, judging by the uniform jacket Sarah saw draped over a chair. An SS Standartenführer, equivalent to a colonel. Documents were scattered across a desk. Photographs on the walls showed the same man, tall, stern-faced, blonde, with Hitler, with Himmler, at various Nazi party rallies. Sarah was examining the documents when she heard it, a sound so soft she almost missed it. A whimper, a child's whimper. She froze, listening. There it was again, coming from behind an overturned armoire in the corner. "Hello?" Sarah called out in German. "Ist da jemand? Is someone there?" Silence. Then another whimper, quickly stifled. Sarah approached the armoire carefully. "I won't hurt you. Ich tu dir nichts. You can come out." She moved the heavy piece of furniture, and her heart stopped. Huddled in the corner, covered in plaster dust and dried blood, was a child. A boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old. Blonde hair, blue eyes wide with terror. He wore what had once been expensive clothes, shorts and a white shirt, now torn and filthy. He was clutching a stuffed bear, also covered in dust. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. The boy stared at her, trembling. His face was streaked with tears, cutting clean lines through the dirt. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days. One side of his head was crusted with dried blood from a wound Sarah couldn't see yet. "It's okay," Sarah said softly in German, kneeling down to his level. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe now. Du bist jetzt sicher." The boy's lips trembled. "Mama?" he whispered. "Wo ist Mama? Where is Mama?" Sarah's throat tightened. She looked around the destroyed apartment at the signs of what had happened here. Artillery strike, probably. Days ago, judging by the dust and dried blood, this child had been alone here, hiding, terrified, maybe for days. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Sarah asked gently. The boy hesitated, then whispered, "Stefan." "Stefan, that's a good name. I'm Sarah. Can you come out? Let me look at you." Stefan shook his head violently, pressing himself further into the corner. "Lieutenant Walsh," Sarah called out. "I need you in here. And a medic kit." Walsh appeared in the doorway, took one look at the scene, and his hard combat expression softened. "Jesus, how long has he been here?" "I don't know. Days, maybe. He's injured. Terrified. We need to get him medical attention." Walsh nodded. "I'll get Johnson. He's got the medical training." Over the next 30 minutes, they coaxed Stefan out of his hiding place. It took patience, gentle words, and finally the offer of a chocolate bar from Tommy Reeves's rations. Stefan emerged slowly, clutching his stuffed bear, his small body shaking. Sergeant Johnson examined him carefully. The head wound was superficial, a cut from flying debris already scabbed over. The boy was dehydrated, malnourished, and traumatized, but physically intact. "He needs fluids, food, and sleep," Johnson said, "and probably a hell of a lot of therapy when this is over." Sarah gave Stefan water from her canteen, making him drink slowly. The boy gulped it desperately, then burst into tears. Sarah pulled him into her arms instinctively, and Stefan clung to her like she was the only solid thing in a collapsing world. "Mama is tot," he sobbed into her shoulder. "Papa is tot. Alice in tot. Mama is dead. Papa is dead. Everyone is dead." Sarah held him, rocking slightly, making soothing sounds. She looked around at the patrol, 8 battle-hardened soldiers watching this scene, with expressions ranging from pity to discomfort to barely suppressed emotion. "We need to find out who he is," Walsh said quietly. "There might be relatives, someone who can take him." Sarah nodded. Still holding Stefan, she began looking through the documents on the desk with one hand. It didn't take long to find what she was looking for. A family photograph in a silver frame, somehow unbroken despite the destruction. A family portrait, the SS officer, a beautiful blonde woman, and a small boy. Stefan. Behind the photograph was a document, a marriage certificate. SS Standartenführer Heinrich Vogel and Greta Vogel, née Schmidt, and a birth certificate, Stefan Heinrich Vogel, born March 15, 1940. Sarah's hands trembled as she looked through more documents. Heinrich Vogel's service record, photographs of him in SS uniform, documents showing his postings, Dachau concentration camp, 1938-1940, then various positions in occupied Poland and Ukraine. Her stomach turned. This wasn't just a Nazi officer. This was an SS officer who'd worked at Dachau, who'd been in the occupied territories where the worst atrocities had occurred. And this small, traumatized child in her arms was his son. "Captain?" Walsh was looking at her strangely. "You okay?" Sarah realized her face must have shown her horror at what she'd discovered. She carefully set down the documents. "This boy is the son of an SS Standartenführer," she said quietly, in English so Stefan wouldn't understand. "Heinrich Vogel. Based on these documents, he was involved in some very bad things." The atmosphere in the room changed immediately. The soldiers' expressions hardened. Tommy Reeves spat on the floor. "SS scum," he muttered. "Probably ran the camps." "The kid's father was a war criminal?" David Chen asked. His voice was tight. Chen's family had been interned in American camps during the war. Not death camps, but the comparison wasn't lost on anyone. "Looks like it," Sarah said. "So, what do we do with him?" Walsh asked. "The boy, I mean." It was a good question. Stefan was an orphan, apparently. His father was dead, killed in the fighting or fled. His mother, too, by the looks of things. He was the child of a Nazi war criminal. No one would want him. And this was Berlin in 1945. Thousands of orphans, overwhelmed relief agencies, chaos everywhere. "We turn him over to civil affairs," Sarah said. "They'll put him in an orphanage or displaced persons camp until they can figure out if he has any relatives. Those places are hellholes," Johnson said quietly. "Overcrowded, undersupplied. Kids are dying in them from disease and malnutrition." Sarah knew he was right. She'd seen the reports. The infrastructure had collapsed. There wasn't enough food, medicine, or shelter for all the refugees and orphans flooding into Allied-controlled zones. Stefan, still clinging to her, had stopped crying. He was looking up at her with those enormous blue eyes, and Sarah saw her own grandmother in them. Grandmother Schmidt, who'd left Germany in 1920, who'd told Sarah stories of the old country, who taught her German so she'd never forget where her family came from. This child wasn't responsible for his father's sins. He was just a little boy who'd lost everything. "I'll take him to headquarters," Sarah said. "Make sure he gets processed properly." Walsh nodded. "All right. We'll finish sweeping this building, then head back. You want an escort? Johnson can come with me. The rest of you continue the patrol." Sarah gathered up the documents about Stefan's identity. They'd be needed for processing. She tried to set Stefan down, but he wouldn't let go, his small hands gripping her uniform jacket with desperate strength. "It's okay," she told him in German. "I'm not leaving you. Ich verlasse dich nicht. We're going somewhere safe." The walk back to Allied headquarters took 40 minutes through the ruins of Berlin. Sarah carried Stefan most of the way. He was light, too light for a child his age, evidence of long malnutrition. Johnson walked beside them, rifle ready, alert for threats. They passed other American patrols, Soviet soldiers celebrating their victory, and German civilians emerging from cellars and rubble, ghostly figures in a dead city. Many were children, orphaned and alone. The scale of the human tragedy was overwhelming. At headquarters, a converted German government building that had somehow survived mostly intact, Sarah took Stefan to the civil affairs section. A harried major named Patterson looked up from a desk covered in forms and files. "Another orphan?" he said wearily. "We've got hundreds already, thousands. The camps are full, Captain. We're doing our best, but—" "I understand, sir. But this one needs special attention. His father was SS. Standartenführer, possibly a war criminal." Patterson's expression hardened. "Christ, that complicates things. The Soviets are executing the families of high-ranking Nazis. If they find out about this kid, which is why we need to protect him," Sarah said firmly. "He's 6 years old. He's not responsible for what his father did." "I know that, Captain, but my hands are tied. We've got no resources. The best I can do is send him to DP Camp 7. It's overcrowded and undersupplied, but at least he'll have food and a roof." Sarah looked down at Stefan, who was still clinging to her, his face buried in her shoulder. She thought about the reports she'd read of conditions in the displaced persons camps. Disease, malnutrition, children dying of preventable illnesses because there weren't enough doctors or medicine. "How long until he could be placed with a family?" she asked. Patterson laughed bitterly. "A family? Captain, who's going to adopt the son of an SS officer? Nobody wants these kids. The best he can hope for is to survive in the camp until Germany gets back on its feet, and then maybe some distant relative will claim him. We're talking years, if ever. Years in a camp. Years of deprivation and trauma, on top of what he'd already endured." Sarah looked at this small boy who'd lost everything, who'd done nothing wrong except be born to the wrong parents. She made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "I'll take him." Patterson stared at her. "What?" "I'll take responsibility for him. Temporarily until we can find a better solution. Captain Mitchell, you can't just—" "This isn't a puppy. This is a German child, an enemy national, the son of an SS officer. There are regulations, procedures. I'm aware of the regulations, Major. I'm also aware that this child will likely die if we send him to an overcrowded camp. I speak German. I have quarters. I can care for him until a proper placement is found. This is highly irregular. These are highly irregular times, sir." Patterson studied her for a long moment. then sighed. You'd need approval from Colonel Brennan, and you'd have to sign documents taking full responsibility. If anything happens to this kid, it's on you. Understood. Where can I find Colonel Brennan? 2 hours and a mountain of paperwork later, Sarah walked out of headquarters with Stefan's hand in hers. She'd signed documents, made promises, called in favors. Colonel Brennan had been skeptical but ultimately agreed to a temporary emergency foster placement until proper arrangements could be made. Sarah had been assigned quarters in a requisitioned apartment building, one of the few still standing in the American sector. It was small but intact. A bedroom, a living room, a tiny kitchen. She'd been living there for 3 weeks, ever since the American forces had taken this part of Berlin. Now she had a roommate. Stefan stood in the middle of the living room, still clutching his stuffed bear, looking lost and terrified. Sarah knelt down to his level. This is where we'll stay for now, she told him in German. You'll be safe here. Are you hungry? Stefan nodded slightly. Sarah had military rations. Not ideal for a child, but better than nothing. She heated some soup on the small stove, cut bread into small pieces. Stefan ate like he was starving, which he probably was. She had to stop him from eating too fast, knowing his stomach couldn't handle too much after days of starvation. After eating, Stefan's eyes started to droop. Sarah ran a bath, lukewarm water, all that was available, and gently cleaned the dirt and blood from his small body. The head wound looked worse clean, but it was healing. He had bruises, evidence of the blast that had destroyed his home and killed his parents. She found some of her clothes, a t-shirt that hung like a dress on his small frame. It would have to do until she could find proper children's clothing. That night, Sarah made him a bed on the couch with blankets and pillows. But when she tried to leave him to sleep in her own room, Stefan panicked, his eyes going wide with terror. Nicht gehen! Bleib hier! Don't go! Stay here! So Sarah lay down on the couch with him, and Stefan curled against her, finally feeling safe enough to sleep. She held this small stranger, this child of her enemy, and felt something shift in her heart. The next days were chaos. Berlin was collapsing into the final death throes of Nazi Germany. Hitler's suicide was confirmed. The Reich surrendered. The war in Europe was over. American soldiers celebrated. But Sarah's world had narrowed to one traumatized 6-year-old boy. Stefan didn't speak for 3 days. He clung to Sarah constantly, panicking if she left his sight. He woke screaming from nightmares. He flinched at loud noises. He was a child utterly broken by war. But slowly, with patience and kindness, Sarah coaxed him back to life. She found children's books in German from abandoned homes, read to him every night, found toys, a wooden truck, some blocks. She sang to him, songs her grandmother had taught her. She held him when he cried, reassured him when he woke screaming from dreams of bombs and death. The soldiers in her unit noticed. Reactions were mixed. Sergeant Johnson brought Stefan chocolate and a toy soldier he'd carved from wood. Kid's been through hell, he said simply. Doesn't matter whose kid he was. He's just a kid now. But others were less accepting. Tommy Reeves confronted Sarah one day in the mess hall. Ma'am, I gotta ask, why are you doing this? That boy's father probably killed Jews, ran a concentration camp, and you're treating his kid like he's your own. Sarah looked at Reeves. His father did terrible things, unforgivable things, but Stefan didn't do those things. He's 6 years old. He's a victim of this war, just like everyone else. And if we can't show mercy to a child, then what did we even win? He's German. He's the enemy. He's a little boy who watched his parents die, who hid in rubble for days, alone and terrified. And if we can't see past nationality and parentage to basic humanity, then we're no better than the Nazis we just defeated. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. I guess you're right, ma'am. It's hard, after everything we've seen. I know. It's hard for me too. But we have to try to be better. We have to try to break the cycle. As weeks passed, Stefan began to heal. His nightmares lessened. He started to smile occasionally. He played with the few toys Sarah had found for him. He followed her everywhere, his small hand always in hers. Sarah knew she was getting attached, knew this was supposed to be temporary, but every day, it became harder to imagine giving him up. One evening, 6 weeks after finding Stefan, Sarah was reading to him when there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Colonel Brennan standing there, looking uncomfortable. Captain Mitchell, may I come in? Of course, sir. Brennan entered, nodded at Stefan, who immediately hid behind Sarah's legs. The colonel sat down heavily. Captain, we've completed our investigation into Heinrich Vogel's background. He pulled out a folder. It's bad. He was at Dachau from 1938 to 1940. Then he was assigned to an Einsatzgruppen unit in Poland and Ukraine. Do you know what that means? Sarah's blood ran cold. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads that had murdered hundreds of thousands of Jews and other undesirables in occupied territories. Yes, sir, I know. Heinrich Vogel was directly responsible for at least 3 massacres. We have documentation, eyewitness testimony from survivors. He was a war criminal, no question. He died 3 days before you found his son, killed by Soviet artillery, ironically. Sarah looked down at Stefan playing quietly with his wooden truck, innocent and oblivious to the horrors his father had committed. The boy doesn't know, she said quietly. He's too young to understand what his father was. I know. Which brings me to the difficult part. Brennan sighed. We've been trying to find relatives. There's an aunt, the mother's sister, who survived the war. She's willing to take the boy. Sarah's heart clenched. Where is she? Hamburg, the British sector. She's a widow, lost her husband and son in the war. She says Stefan is her only living relative and she wants him. This was what was supposed to happen. A relative had been found. Stefan would be reunited with family. This was the right outcome. So why did it feel like Sarah's heart was being ripped out? When? She managed to ask. Transport can be arranged next week. I'm sorry, Captain. I know you've grown attached, but this is best for the boy. He should be with family, with someone who shares his language, his culture. After Brennan left, Sarah sat with Stefan, watching him play. How could she explain this to him? How could she send him away? That night, after Stefan fell asleep, Sarah wrote a letter to her parents back in Pennsylvania. She told them everything. Finding Stefan, learning about his father's crimes, caring for him these past weeks, the attachment she'd formed. I know I should be relieved that he has family, she wrote. I know this is the right thing, but Mom, Dad, I love him. In 6 weeks, this child has become part of my heart, and I don't know how to let him go. The week passed too quickly. Sarah tried to prepare Stefan, tried to explain that he was going to live with his Aunt Margaret, but Stefan didn't understand, or didn't want to. Nein, he cried when she tried to explain. Ich will bei dir bleiben. I want to stay with you. I know, sweetheart. I know. But your aunt loves you. She's family. Du bist meine Familie. You are my family. Sarah held him while he sobbed, her own tears falling into his blonde hair. The day came. A jeep arrived to take them to Hamburg. Sarah had packed Stefan's few belongings, some clothes she'd scrounged, the stuffed bear, the toys. They drove through occupied Germany, past ruins and refugees, and the wreckage of war. Hamburg had been devastated by Allied bombing, but the British had begun restoration efforts. Stefan's aunt lived in a small apartment in a partially rebuilt neighborhood. Margareta Schroeder was in her 40s, thin and careworn, with Stefan's blue eyes. She wept when she saw him. Stefan, oh mein kleiner Stefan. She gathered him into her arms, speaking rapid German, crying and laughing. Stefan looked confused, uncomfortable. He didn't remember this aunt. He'd been too young when he'd last seen her. This was a stranger. He reached back for Sarah. It took 2 hours to make the transition. Margaret was kind, patient, understanding. She showed Stefan his new room, small but clean, with a bed and some toys she'd managed to find. She made him food. She talked to him gently about his mother, her sister, about family memories. But Stefan kept looking back at Sarah with betrayed, terrified eyes. Finally, it was time for Sarah to leave. She knelt down, taking Stefan's small hands in hers. You're going to be happy here, she told him in German, barely able to speak past the lump in her throat. Your aunt loves you so much, she'll take good care of you. Komm mit mir. Come with me, Stefan begged. Bitte, please. I can't, sweetheart. I have to go back to work. I have to go home to America soon. Dan nehme mich mit. Then take me with you. Sarah looked into those blue eyes and saw her own heart breaking reflected there. She pulled him into a fierce hug. I love you, Stefan. I will always love you. Be good for your aunt, okay? Be happy. Live a good life. She kissed his forehead, then stood up quickly before she lost her resolve. Margaret was crying too, understanding the bond that had formed. Thank you, Margaret said in halting English. Thank you for saving him, for loving him. Sarah couldn't speak. She just nodded and walked out. Stefan's cries of, Sarah, Sarah, following her down the stairs. She made it to the jeep before she broke down completely, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe. Sergeant Johnson, who'd driven her, tactfully said nothing, just handed her a handkerchief and started the engine. Sarah returned to Berlin. The war was over. Her unit would be shipping out soon, going home. She threw herself into work, processing paperwork, helping with reconstruction efforts, trying not to think about a small blonde boy in Hamburg. 3 months passed. Sarah was scheduled to ship out in a week, returning to the States. She'd done her duty. The war was won. It was time to go home and try to rebuild her own life. Then she received a letter from Margaret Schroeder. "Dear Captain Mitchell, I write to you with a heavy heart. Stefan is not doing well. He cries for you every night. He refuses to eat. He has terrible nightmares. The doctor says it is trauma, but I think it is more. He bonded with you in those weeks. You became his mother in his heart. I love my nephew, but I am not blind. He needs you, and perhaps you need him too. I have spoken with British authorities. They tell me it may be possible for you to adopt Stefan if you wish. It would require paperwork, time, and approval from both American and British authorities, but it is possible. I will not stand in the way if this is what you want. Stefan's happiness matters more than my pride. He has lost so much. If he can have a mother who loves him, who he loves, then that is what he should have. Please think about this. And please, whatever you decide, come visit him. He needs to see you." With respect and gratitude, Margaret Schroeder Sarah read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking. Adopt Stefan. Take him to America. Raise him as her own son. It was insane. She was single, 32, with a teaching career to return to. She'd be raising the son of an SS war criminal. People would judge, would condemn. It would be difficult, complicated, maybe impossible. But God, she wanted it, wanted him. This child who'd grabbed hold of her heart in a ruined Berlin apartment and never let go. Sarah went to Colonel Brennan. "Sir, I need to request an extension of my service here. And I need help with some paperwork. I want to adopt a German orphan." Brennan looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "Captain, do you understand what you're asking? The complications? The scrutiny?" "Yes, sir. I understand. But I love him, and he needs me. And that's enough." It took 6 months. 6 months of paperwork, investigations, interviews, bureaucratic nightmares. Sarah extended her service twice. She visited Stefan in Hamburg every week she could get away. Each visit, he clung to her more tightly, his eyes brighter, his smiles more frequent. Margaret proved to be an ally. She testified that Stefan needed Sarah, that she herself couldn't provide what he needed. She was willing to relinquish her guardianship if it meant Stefan could be happy. There was resistance. Questions about Sarah's marital status, her age, her ability to provide for a child. Questions about Stefan's background, his father's crimes, whether the child could be denazified, whether it was appropriate for an American to adopt the son of an SS officer. But Sarah was stubborn, and she had help. Soldiers from her unit wrote testimonials. Colonel Brennan, despite his initial skepticism, vouched for her character. Even some of the German officials she'd worked with supported her application. On December 15, 1945, exactly 8 months after finding Stefan in the rubble, Sarah stood in a British military courthouse in Hamburg. A judge reviewed the final papers, looked at Sarah, looked at Stefan, who stood beside her, holding her hand, his eyes huge and hopeful. "This is highly unusual," the judge said. "But these are unusual times. The court finds that it is in the best interest of the child to be placed with Captain Mitchell. Adoption approved." Stefan looked up at Sarah, not quite understanding. "What does that mean?" he asked in German. Sarah knelt down, taking both his hands, tears streaming down her face. "It means you're my son now. Forever. You're coming home with me to America. We're going to be a family." Stefan's face transformed with joy. He threw his arms around her neck. "Mama?" "Yes, sweetheart. I'm your mama now." They sailed for America in January 1946. Sarah had resigned from the army, ready to return to civilian life. Stefan stood at the ship's rail beside her, watching the ocean, holding tight to her hand. "Will people in America like me?" he asked in the English he was rapidly learning. Sarah thought about this question carefully. She wouldn't lie to him. "Some will, some won't. Some people will be angry that your father was a Nazi. Some will judge you for something you didn't do. It won't be easy. Will you still love me? Always. Forever. No matter what anyone else thinks." They arrived in New York Harbor on a gray January morning. As the ship passed the Statue of Liberty, Sarah pointed it out to Stefan. "See that statue? It says, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." That's you now. You're an American. You're free. You can be whoever you want to be, not what your father was. Sarah's parents met them in New York. They'd been skeptical when Sarah had first written about adopting Stefan. Her mother had asked pointed questions about his background. But when they saw Sarah with Stefan, saw the love between them, their hearts melted. "Welcome home, grandson," Sarah's father said in German, the language of his own parents. He knelt down to Stefan's level. "Welcome to America." Returning to their small Pennsylvania town was harder. News had spread about Sarah Mitchell, the local girl who'd come home from the war with a German orphan, the son of an SS officer. Reactions ranged from supportive to hostile. Some neighbors welcomed them, others crossed the street to avoid them. Stefan was called names at school: Nazi, Kraut, Hitler's boy. He came home crying more than once, but he also made friends, found teachers who saw him as just a child, found Americans who believed in second chances, in judging people by their own actions rather than their parents' sins. Sarah returned to teaching, bringing Stefan up with love, discipline, and constant reminders that he was not defined by where he came from, but by who he chose to be. Stefan grew up American. He learned English fluently, though Sarah made sure he retained his German. He played baseball, went to school dances, got into trouble like any normal boy. He also excelled academically, driven by a deep need to prove himself, to be worthy of the mother who'd chosen him. He never forgot his origins. Sarah never let him. On his 10th birthday, she sat him down and, age-appropriately, told him about his biological father, about the SS, about the terrible things Heinrich Vogel had done. Stefan cried that night, cried for the victims his father had murdered, cried for shame and horror at being related to a monster, cried for fear that he might have inherited some darkness from that man. Sarah held him and told him the truth. "You are not your father. You are not defined by his blood or his crimes. You are defined by your choices, by your kindness, by your courage. And every day you choose to be a good person. That's what matters." Stefan took his mother's words to heart. He became passionate about justice, about human rights. In high school, he wrote an essay about his father's crimes and his own determination to dedicate his life to making amends. The essay won a national competition. He went to college on scholarship, studying international law. He became a lawyer, then a human rights advocate, working to prosecute war criminals and protect refugees. He married a woman named Rachel, a Jewish woman whose own grandparents had survived the Holocaust. When Stefan told her about his father, about his origins, Rachel held his hands and said, "You are not your father. You are the man who chose to spend his life fighting against everything your father stood for. That's who you are." They had 3 children. Stefan and Sarah made sure those children grew up knowing their complicated family history, knowing that their grandfather had been a Nazi war criminal, also knowing that their grandmother had been a hero who'd chosen love over hate, who'd saved a child when she could have walked away. Sarah lived to be 89 years old. At her funeral in 2002, Stefan, now in his 60s, a respected international lawyer with grandchildren of his own, gave the eulogy. "My mother saved my life twice," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Once when she pulled me from the rubble of my father's sins, and once when she chose to love me anyway, when she saw past my parentage to see just a terrified child who needed a mother." He paused, looking at the photograph of Sarah in her army uniform, young and determined.